Hi guys. Last night we got some really tragic news, and I was really in disbelief seeing it initially, and I just couldn't quite believe it was real. And then I woke up today and it was all over my Twitter feed, and it started to really hit home that it is real, and it's the tragic and horrific death of Vince Zampella. Now, for this video, I think I want to just speak a bit to the impact that Vince has had on my life, because it really cannot be understated. It's impossible to truly characterize how big an impact he has had, but I want to try. And I think I also want to try to also help, for those of you that are less familiar with his work or newer to the games industry, maybe you're a little younger, I want to try and help you understand just how incredible an impact he has had, and crucially, how impossible his record is. It's just impossible. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of talk through Vince's history in the space, and I'll then intertwine it with my history in playing his work and making content on his work, and finally getting to work with him as recently as this year. So Vince first entered my vision of the games industry when he was working on Call of Duty, but he was working on games prior. He worked on Medal of Honor, Allied Assault, and this was right at the start of the 2000s, so long time ago now. And at the time, video games, especially in the shooter kind of space, had all, for the most part, had a similar DNA of almost being that kind of like, whether it's Counter-Strike-y feel or the Doom kind of feel, right? They were very arcadey a lot of the time. And when Vince worked on Allied Assault, I think we started to see a little bit of, that's my alarm going off. We started to see a little bit of a shift in people's approaches to shooters as an art form, and realizing that there was story to be told here that could really move people and that could honor the veterans that were fighting in World War II and that were fighting over the years for their countries and for freedom. And we saw that beginning, I think, around that time, and soon afterwards, Infinity Ward ended up being formed. Vince was a co-founder of Infinity Ward, and the idea was that they would be making a Medal of Honor killer, right? They'd be making something that would be even better than that modern that Medal of Honor sort of gem that had been crafted there. And they went on to develop Call of Duty, and then they made another Call of Duty, and they made another Call of Duty, and as the leadership of Infinity Ward, Vince was overseeing this industry Goliath being born. Like, we talk about Call of Duty now, and it's just this titan that we assume is just always the biggest, and it's like, oh well, of course it's the biggest, it's Call of Duty. But that came from somewhere, and it came from the nurture of Vince Zampella. And I think it was Call of Duty 4, really, which began to truly show how revolutionary I think he was and his team were. There are so many things you can point to in Call of Duty 4 and trace from that point onwards to culture today that absolutely would not exist without that game. So many things. And the same can be said for Modern Warfare 2. I was making Modern Warfare 2 content, actually, back in the day. I'm dating myself here a little bit, but I have been making YouTube videos for a very long time, and I made videos on that game, and I covered its launch, and I covered its DLCs, and I was making all sorts of content. And I was also a massive fan. I was playing it tons. And my friends were playing it tons. It was all we talked about, and it pushed the industry forward in so many ways. COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2, two of the greatest shooters of all time, and two of the biggest impacts on the industry that the shooter space has ever seen. No singular multiplayer game today, no singular shooter today exists in a vacuum uninfluenced by COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2 under Vince Zampella. Zero. And I say that without any exaggeration. It is truly an indelible mark on the industry in the best possible way. It's an imprint on the DNA of what it means to be a shooter, period, full stop, in video games. And those games were really transformational. And whether it's choices they made in the storytelling, right? Taking what had begun with games like Medal of Honor, Allied Assault, and then been iterated on and continued in the early Call of Duties, and then fleshed out and developed in a much more significant way in COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2. Whether it's that from a story perspective, whether it's just the feel of the game, whether it's the continuous systems to keep you engaged and keep you loving the game, whether it's your first hour into it or your 100th hour, whether it's the social systems around it, whether it's some of the technological systems. Like, we didn't have so many elements of building a game today that are so normal now, that they were just not present back then. And it was, again, under Vince's leadership that we saw things like, host migration in Modern Warfare 2, right? Changing Call of Duty over to be using texture streaming, like all these different little technological building blocks that the public don't even think about have a home in the Call of Duty canon under Vince Zampella's leadership. They have a source, they have a beginning, right? And again, I can't stress enough how we all take so much of this for granted today, but this had to come from somewhere. And it came from the hard work that Vince and Vince's team was doing for years and years and years in this early period of the video games industry. So Modern Warfare 2 came out, and I started making content and was absolutely blown away by just the polish of that game. It was unreal, completely unreal. And then Vince was no longer at Infinity Ward, and it was a bit confusing as to what was going on. And I was young, and I didn't necessarily understand all the puzzle pieces here. But what my understanding is, essentially, from what happened, is that Vince had a contract with Activision whereby he would launch Modern Warfare 2, and then he would either gain some chunk of ownership over Call of Duty, or he'd at the very least be due a significant amount of bonus payments for having shipped the game. And Activision then wrongly fired him for reasons that they deemed him being scheming and insubordinate and what have you. And they did this essentially to try and weasel their way out of paying him what he was due based on their contract. And Vince could quite easily have just sued Activision here and then walked away and stopped making games. Like, ultimately, that lawsuit ended up being settled out of court, and I think the understanding in the industry is that Vince was paid pretty handsomely by Activision. This was a man who could absolutely have just retired there. He'd done it, right? He'd made Medal of Honor, Allied Assault, and then he'd gone on to make Call of Duty, and he'd made two of the best games in COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2 of all time. He could have hung up his hat. Instead, he said, well, I'll take these millions of dollars, but I'm also here going to found Respawn. And Respawn went on immediately to make Titanfall. And again, there is nothing like Titanfall in the industry at the time. There's no precedent for a game like that. He makes Titanfall, and then he makes Titanfall 2, and then Apex Legends, and then the Star Wars games. He makes Fallen Order, and then Jedi Survivor, and like Respawn is killing it game after game after game. And you have to ask, how is it possible that COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2 were as good as they were? And you could argue, well, it was a fluke of the fact that Call of Duty was just on this path of snowballing momentum, and it just happened. But it clearly didn't just happen. Somebody made it happen, right? And then somebody made Titanfall 1 happen. Somebody made that industry darling, that beloved game, come from somewhere. And then Titanfall 2 didn't just happen. And the Star Wars games didn't just happen. They aren't as loved as they are for no reason, by some sheer coincidence. The through line through it all is Vince Zampella over and over and over again. And I think the tragically, the closing chapter of that insane, incredible run is his work in the last several years on Battlefield. Because Battlefield, when Vince was sort of tapped to work on the project, was not in a good place. Like, let's not rewrite history here. Battlefield 2042 was received dreadfully. It just was. It was not in a good place at all. And Vince didn't work on the launch of 2042. He was basically brought in to say, like, this needs some love, and it needs Vince Zampella. Who else could have done that? I don't know. I don't know if anyone could have. But he was brought in, and a couple of years went by, and then this year, that's another alarm going off, sorry. This year, I was invited out as a content creator, now doing this professionally, full-time, having been doing it full-time for many years, thanks to the inspiration and the creative ammunition that Vince supplied me with indirectly through the incredible games that he was making. I've managed to make a career of this, and I was invited out to work with the Battlefield team on the global reveal of their multiplayer. I was in LA with all the EA staff, and I got a very brief opportunity to speak to Vince very, very briefly. I wish it had been longer. And I played the game for the first time, and I was shocked because somehow, though I think the odds were entirely stacked against him, he had managed it. He'd managed to transform this creaky, stumbling Battlefield IP, one that had really become a little unsure, I think, of its footing. And suddenly, with the Vince Zampella charm installed, it was working. It was firing on all cylinders, and the reveal went incredibly well. He spoke at the reveal. He introduced the game, and spoke to the incredible work that all of the teams working on the game were doing, because it wasn't just one singular studio, there were multiple that were involved, and he spoke to all of their hard work, and the game launched, and it's the most successful Battlefield game of all time. And I think, again, in isolation, you could argue, well, it was just because Call of Duty was having a rough year this year, and it was just sort of a coincidence that there weren't any other sort of similar games that would have been big competition, and like you could argue this, that, and the other. But you can only argue that to such an extent. When you look at all the other games, you could also make arguments for saying, Titanfall was only a success because of this, and I mean, it's hard to even get the words out of my mouth, but like Modern Warfare 2 was only a success because of this. But you stack all these things up in a continuum of Vince Zampella's career and legacy and corpus, and the thing that it always comes back to is his hard work, his dedication to the industry, his dedication to video games, his dedication to the fans, and the sparkle that he had in his eye, and the thing that would have driven him forward day to day when he was fired from Infinity Ward and decided to keep on going. And when he killed it with Titanfall and decided to keep on going. When Apex happened and he kept going. Like, this was so clearly a man driven by an absolutely all-encompassing love of this medium. And it is really, truly impossible for me to even begin to appropriately characterize just how much of a Goliath in this space he has been, and how deeply, deeply tragic it is that he's gone. So it's so sad. I've never heard anyone say a single bad word about that man. And in this industry, there is a lot of room for disagreement, and there's a lot of room for politics, and there's a lot of room for lack of a better word, like sort of shade and digs into competitors and all sorts. I've never heard a single person say a bad word about Vince Zampella. I think he just loved what he did. The very few interactions I've ever had with him were wonderful. His legacy in terms of the games he worked on, spectacular. And without his hard work on those earlier games in his career, I would not have been able to live the life that I've lived for the last 20 years. I just would not be here. And I think it's important that you also understand that it's not just me. There are so many, like thousands and thousands of now industry veterans, whether it's on the game development side or it's in the game's press or whether it's content creators, that would not be here if not for Vince Zampella. In many ways, you can look back at the early days of the Sidemen and PewDiePie and Mr. Beast, and you can take all of these absolute titans of content creation, right, to speak to my own personal world, and so many of them owe so much of their early attachment to this space to Vince Zampella and to the games that he and his team so meticulously crafted. It's not an overstatement. It's not an exaggeration. It's not hyperbole. And it's easy, I think, to see the passing of a figure like this in the games industry and to think, well, that's just the name of a person that I recognize, and And that's really sad, right? I think it can be really easy, especially if you maybe didn't grow up with some of those games, or you're less sort of tapped into the press of the industry or what have you. I think it would be understandable for you to be like, oh, I think I've heard that name before. Oh, rest in peace. But there is a real difference between just another name you recognize and someone as pivotal to all of our lives in this space as he was. I really am gutted I never got to express this to him at length in person. Because I think had another year or two passed, had a little more time passed, I think I might have gotten that opportunity through the work that he's been doing with Battlefield, and the fact that our proximity went from being fairly nearby one another in the early days of my career when he was working on Call of Duty to being a little further apart, but then sort of getting a little closer again in the fact that I've been covering Battlefield and working with that team this year. I think I might have had a chance to express that to him, and the good thing is that it is absolutely something I know he was aware of, the impact that he had on people over the years. I know because I've had friends that have expressed it to him, and everyone has the same story with Vince Zampella. Everyone has the same story. He changed their life through the art he put out into the world and through his endless determination to make another banger. Everyone has the same story with Vince. And so I know he'd heard it a million times, and he didn't need me to tell him how much it meant to me personally, because it meant so much to so many. And it's horrendous that he's gone. It's horrendous. But he really, truly will never be forgotten as one of the greatest to ever do it in video games. And I say that with no exaggeration. Such a huge loss. And so tragic that some of the greatest years of his career may have been ahead of him, and we will never know. So Vince, thank you for everything you've done. I wish I could have said this to you in person. I wish I could have expressed my gratitude. But for now, this video is going to have to do. Rest in peace. And I'll never ever take for granted the impact that you've had on my life.